So in closing the abortion briefing lecture, I want to take a moment and kind of expand the horizon of considerations. Oftentimes when, say, legislatures or theorists or even individual people think about abortion, they think about abortion as an act and in isolation from other issues. They may think about the woman or the child or maybe even both, but maybe no one else. And so I'd like to just take a moment to remind ourselves that reproductive choices are choices that can affect a number of individuals across a number of dimensions. And so it's important, I think, to have that in the back of your mind when you're looking at these arguments and theoretical papers that focus exclusively on one or two individuals and on a single act. So, for instance, abortion is intimately connected with issues regarding human sexuality, responsible reproductive practices, and disease prevention. And so things like the Hyde Amendment that prohibits or restricts funding for abortions or payments to healthcare providers who provide abortions in addition to other healthcare services can impact women's health organizations like Planned Parenthood. In fact, Planned Parenthood has had its funding threatened many times because in addition to other women's health services that it provides, it does provide abortions. And when that happens, Planned Parenthood points out that they provide contraceptive counseling and supplies, they provide prenatal care, they provide cancer screening, they provide healthy visit treatment, and so on. Right? And so they provide a wide range of women's healthcare services, and that pulling funding from them because they provide abortions can potentially limit women's access to and the quality of all sorts of healthcare. Similarly, when theorists or legislators think of life as beginning at conception and use that as a basis for thinking about restrictions on reproductive choices, and that's going to have impacts that go beyond that mere act of abortion that we're thinking about. So, at least as standardly conceived. So, for example, most female birth control methods, the IUD, the pill, morning after pills like Plan B, they all prevent pregnancy by acting to prevent the implantation of fertilized eggs. They don't prevent fertilization. And so, oftentimes, they prevent the implantation of fertilized eggs. If life begins at conception, then that will have implications for all of these methods of birth control. Similarly, a notion that life begins at conception and legal protections begin at conception can have implications for the roughly 1 in 5 pregnancies that result in a miscarriage in the United States every year, as well as for the 24,000 babies that are designated by the CDC as stillborn babies, that is, babies that aren't born alive but have the pregnancy has progressed to 20 weeks or more. Now, in addition to those healthcare and reproductive issues, there are also economic issues, dimensions that arise with regard to reproductive choices. So in the 60s, studies began to show that anti-abortion laws were linked to other social issues, especially poverty. A study in New York City found that women and families affected by poverty were disproportionately impacted by anti-abortion laws. 8% of women studied reported attempting to terminate a pregnancy by illegal abortion, but 77% reported attempting a self-induced abortion, while just 2% reported any physician assistance. And 38% of the people surveyed reported that a friend or a relative or an acquaintance had attempted to get an abortion. And in fact, you see a general trend that as the level of affluence in a society increases, the number of children that individual families choose to have tends to decrease. And there's an economic cost associated with reproductive choices, and when people start to take that economic cost into account when they consider quality of life issues for themselves and for the potential children, all of these things are also dimensions of reproductive choices that are going to be direct or collateral consequences of the choices that people make. In addition to that, we can think about a number of individuals that are going to be impacted by reproductive choices that are made by people. So in the case of abortion, it's obvious that women are being impacted by attempts to restrict or to allow them to make particular reproductive choices. So women are going to be concerned about whether or not they'll have a choice as to whether or not to terminate a pregnancy if they discover that the fetus has a birth defect, or the pregnancy becomes complicated in a way that, say, threatens their life or might well result in the child having serious medical problems. Now, this isn't to say that they should always choose to abort those fetuses, or even if they shouldn't choose to abort those fetuses. But those kind of situations pose real risks, real costs, financial costs, emotional costs, and so on. And so they're real consequences that women have to consider and do consider all the time. Women who have been victims of crimes like rape and incest may well not want to carry a child that resulted from that criminal act to term, and that's another impact, another dimension that is involved in women's reproductive choices. In general, women in making reproductive choices are going to be considering whether now is the right time for them to have a child, whether they're ever going to be in a position to have a child, whether they want to have a child, and so on. And any attempts to limit their reproductive choices are going to have these impacts, whether you think those impacts are good or bad. Of course, the fetuses are also impacted by reproductive choices. So a fetus that gets aborted isn't going to go on to live a life. And some people ideally may argue that that deprives a child of a future life like ours, as we'll see. But it also can potentially prevent them from living a life of abuse, of physical or financial neglect, of genetic or other disease. And so those impacts can be potentially positive. They can also be potentially negative for a fetus. Husbands and boyfriends, right? When they make these decisions, hopefully when they talk with pregnant women and together make choices, right? They're making commitments that are going to last over a very long period of time. Even people who don't want to necessarily participate in those conversations are going to have commitments at the very worst end of the scheme, right? Divorce and child support laws require husbands and boyfriends to maintain a certain amount of financial responsibility for children for 18 or 21 years. And so choices that they make and that women make are going to have an impact on them, positive or negative. Siblings, right? So how many children are in your family, what's the makeup, and so on. They'll be impacted by reproductive choices that are made by their parents as well. Again, those choices could be positive or they could be negative. Right? A sibling who's got a new baby brother or sister who's soaking up all the financial resources, time, and emotional energy of the parents because of a birth defect or some other difficulty is going to have a serious impact on the life of the other sibling. Extended family. Right? So the parents of pregnant women and their boyfriends and husbands, grandparents, cousins, brothers. Oftentimes, extended family makes contributions to the care of children, financial contributions or contributions in the form of additional support for care of the child and so on. And so they'll be affected by reproductive choices made by individuals as well. And even society at large is affected by reproductive choices made by individuals. Society is going to pay to help educate that child. They're going to paid to provide basic medical care for the child and basic food and shelter for the child if the family can't provide it for them. In the most awful circumstances, they're going to step in and remove the child from an abusive or neglective household. All of these things are costs that society will incur based on the reproductive choices of individuals. So I'm not trying to prioritize or advocate pro or against any side of these. I just want us to take a step back and realize that these choices, like most of the choices that we think about in this class, really, they're going to affect a bunch of individuals on a bunch of different dimensions. And so if we just focus on a single act, one person or two people, we oftentimes neglect the inherent complexity of the actual real world event.